There's a woman standing in a bank, 300 meters from where a bomb will explode in 60 seconds. She will survive. Almost no one else at this distance will. The reason she survives contains one of the most unsettling truths about nuclear weapons: that life and death can depend on whether you happen to be facing the right direction when the world ends. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start at 8:14 a.m. It is August 6th, 1945, and Hiroshima is experiencing what no one yet realizes is the last ordinary minute of its existence. The city breathes with summer Monday rhythms: commuters, coffee, conversations, the ordinary hum of 340,000 people going about their lives. The kind of morning so unremarkable that nobody will remember what they were doing at 8:14, because at 8:16, nothing that came before will matter anymore. The Ota River flows through its 7 channels, dividing the city into 6 island districts that fan out like fingers toward Hiroshima Bay. The water reflects the early morning sky. It is already warm, the air humid and thick with the promise of another sweltering August day. On the riverbanks, people move along their morning routes. Some are walking to work. Others are already at their jobs. Children are making their way to school, though many schools have suspended regular classes because of the war. Instead, young students aged 11 to 14 have been mobilized for something more urgent: demolishing buildings to create fire breaks in case American bombers return. Here's something strange. Hiroshima has been spared, while Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and dozens of other Japanese cities have been devastated by waves of B-29 bombers dropping incendiary bombs. Hiroshima remains almost untouched. The city's residents whisper theories. Maybe it's being saved for American occupation headquarters. Maybe relatives in Hawaii have petitioned Washington to spare the city. They're wrong on both counts. The truth is darker. Hiroshima has been deliberately preserved, kept intact like a laboratory specimen, so that American scientists can accurately measure the effects of a weapon the world has never seen. The city's flat geography, its dense wooden construction, its concentrated population, these aren't coincidences. They're criteria. Hiroshima has been chosen precisely because it hasn't been bombed. And it hasn't been bombed because it's been chosen. This morning, as the clock ticks toward 8:15, students aged 11 to 14 are working in the open air, creating fire breaks by demolishing buildings. These children are preparing for conventional bombers that will never come. The threat they're defending against is already 6 miles above them, falling. The population of Hiroshima on this morning stands at approximately 340 to 350,000 people. This number includes civilians, military personnel from the 2nd Army headquarters stationed here, and thousands of Korean forced laborers brought to work in the city's war industries. The population had once peaked at over 380,000 earlier in the war, but systematic evacuations ordered by the Japanese government had gradually reduced the number of residents. Still, Hiroshima remains a city of considerable importance. It is a major military hub, a communication center, a storage depot, and an assembly point for troops. The harbor has seen thousands of soldiers depart for distant battlefields, crowds shouting "Banzai" as ships pulled away from the docks. The city itself sits on the broad, flat delta of the Ota River, almost entirely level and only slightly above sea level. This geography makes it particularly vulnerable to fire, and most of the buildings are wooden structures with tile roofs, built in the traditional Japanese style that has defined the urban landscape for centuries. In the center of the city, there are some reinforced concrete buildings, constructed with unusually strong specifications because of earthquake concerns. These structures stand out among the smaller wooden homes and workshops that crowd the residential neighborhoods. About 7 square miles of the city's 26 square mile area are densely built up, with 75% of the population concentrated in this central zone. At 8:14 a.m., in the Bank of Hiroshima, located about 300 meters from what will become known as the Hypocenter, a 20-year-old woman named Akiko Takakura signs her name in the attendance book. She begins her morning routine, dusting desks, organizing papers. Here's the detail that will save her life, though she doesn't know it yet. She's facing away from the windows. In 1 minute, this arbitrary orientation, this random direction she happens to be facing while doing mundane office work, will determine whether she lives or dies. The window behind her is about to become a portal to hell itself. But because she's facing the other way, she will be one of only a handful of people within 300 meters of the explosion to survive the first minute. The position of her body at 8:17 a.m. will matter more than any decision she's ever made. 2 miles away, Reverend Kiyoshi Tanimoto is visiting a friend in the western suburbs of the city. He had spent the previous night helping to evacuate belongings from homes being demolished for the fire breaks. Now he stands in his friend's garden, looking east toward the city center, toward the bridges and rivers and rooftops that spread across the delta like a vast, intricate pattern. At Hiroshima Station, trains are arriving and departing. People hurry across platforms, carry bags, say goodbyes, check watches. In the harbor district, dock workers are already sweating in the morning heat. In hospital wards, doctors make their rounds. In the military barracks at Hiroshima Castle, soldiers are engaged in physical training on the parade grounds, running drills under the watchful eyes of their officers. At the Red Cross Hospital, nurses tend to patients. In neighborhoods throughout the city, mothers prepare breakfast, tend to children, hang laundry, sweep floors. Shop owners open their doors. Factory workers clock in at their posts. 6 miles directly overhead, though no one in Hiroshima can see it yet, a B-29 superfortress called the Enola Gay carries in its bomb bay something that weighs 10,000 pounds and contains less than 1 kilogram of material that will actually explode. That single kilogram, roughly the weight of a textbook, will release energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. It will do in 1 minute what it would take 1,000 conventional bombers weeks to accomplish. Here's what makes this particular Monday morning so tragically ordinary. The people of Hiroshima have heard air raid sirens earlier. Weather reconnaissance B-29s passed overhead at 7:09 a.m. The all-clear sounded at 7:31 a.m. When the Enola Gay approaches at 8:09 a.m., accompanied by 2 observation planes, most people barely notice. After months of air raid alerts that led to nothing, many have learned to ignore the warning system. Some do look up and see 3 aircraft. A small raid, unthreatening. The irony is crushing. The smallest raid Hiroshima will ever experience is also the only one that matters. Colonel Paul Tibbets, who named the aircraft after his mother, is now approaching his target. The bomb in his bay has cost $2 billion to develop and has consumed the labor of over 130,000 people working in secret across America for years. The Manhattan Project, this massive scientific and industrial effort, has produced exactly 2 functional atomic bombs. One was tested in New Mexico 3 weeks ago. The other is currently falling through clear morning air toward Hiroshima. At 8:17 a.m., the Enola Gay's bombardier, Major Thomas Farabee, can see his target through the bomb site, the T-shaped Ioi Bridge that spans the Oda River in the heart of Hiroshima. A 60-second timer begins counting down. The aircraft is flying at 31,600 feet. The weather is clear. Visibility is perfect. The city spreads below like a detailed map. Farabee makes final adjustments. In Hiroshima, at this moment, people do not yet know that their city has been chosen. They do not know that their city was selected specifically because it had not been bombed before, which meant that the power of this new weapon could be accurately assessed. They do not know that their city's flat geography and dense urban core make it an ideal testing ground for what military planners have called blast effect. They do not know about the Manhattan Project, the secret American program that has cost $2 billion and employed over 130,000 people to develop this weapon. They do not know about the debate among American leaders about whether to use such a weapon, about the scientists who built it with the grim understanding that it would kill tens of thousands of people in seconds, about President Harry Truman's decision to proceed with the bombing in hopes of bringing a swift end to the war and avoiding a land invasion of Japan that might cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties. At 8:15 a.m., Major Farabee announces, "Bomb away." Little boy is released from the bomb bay. It begins to fall through 6 miles of clear morning sky. The Enola Gay immediately executes a sharp diving turn to escape the blast radius, dropping one wing and diving away at maximum speed. The 2 other B-29s accompanying the Enola Gay, observer planes carrying cameras and scientific instruments, do the same. Their crews know what is coming. They have been trained for this mission for months. They have been told to put on special welder's goggles to protect their eyes from the flash. They have practiced their evasive maneuvers dozens of times. Now they execute them with precision, banking hard, diving, racing to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the falling bomb. In Hiroshima, some people hear the airplane engines overhead. The sound is distinctive, different from the Japanese planes they are accustomed to hearing. An air raid alert had sounded earlier in the morning when American weather reconnaissance planes passed over the city, but the all clear had been given. Now, at 8:15, most people pay little attention to the drone of engines high above. Those who do look up see nothing unusual. The sky is clear and blue. The sun is already bright. It is a beautiful summer morning. Little boy falls for 43 seconds. The weapon is a marvel of engineering, though its design is relatively simple compared to the implosion-type plutonium bomb that will be dropped on Nagasaki 3 days later. Inside Little Boy, a conventional explosive will fire a hollow uranium cylinder, shaped like a bullet, through a gun barrel at a target cylinder of uranium. When the 2 pieces combine, they will exceed the critical mass needed to sustain a chain reaction. The uranium-235 atoms, each with 92 protons in their nuclei, are unstable. When a neutron strikes a uranium-235 nucleus, it will split, releasing tremendous energy and 2 or 3 more neutrons. These neutrons will strike other uranium nuclei, which will split and release more neutrons. This process, doubling and redoubling through approximately 80 iterations, will take place in less than a millionth of a second. The energy released will be equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT, though less than 2% of the uranium will actually undergo fission. The rest will simply be blown apart in the explosion. At 8:16 a.m., Little Boy detonates at an altitude of 1,900 feet above Shima Surgical Clinic, approximately 240 meters southeast of the intended aiming point at the Aoi Bridge. The crosswind has pushed the bomb slightly off target, but the difference is negligible. The weapon functions exactly as designed. Critical mass is achieved. The chain reaction begins. In that instant, the world changes. 8:15:17. The detonation. Here's something most people don't realize about nuclear weapons. They're spectacularly inefficient. Little Boy contains 64 kilograms of uranium-235, but less than 1 kilogram, less than 2%, will actually undergo fission. The rest will simply be blown apart by the explosion. This weapon that took years to build, cost billions to develop, and will kill 80,000 people, is 98% waste. But that 2% is enough to change the world. The moment of detonation exists at a scale so small and so fast that human perception cannot grasp it. This is the realm of microseconds and nuclear physics, where cause and effect are separated by time intervals shorter than a heartbeat. Inside Little Boy, as the uranium bullet speeds down the gun barrel at approximately 1,000 feet per second, several things happen simultaneously. The hollow cylinder of uranium-235, weighing approximately 38.5 kilograms, slams into the target cylinder, weighing approximately 25.6 kilograms. The 2 masses become one. The combined mass exceeds the critical threshold of 52 kilograms needed to sustain a chain reaction. But this is not enough by itself. The design of the bomb must hold these uranium masses together long enough for the chain reaction to proceed. If they separate too quickly, the weapon will merely fizzle, releasing only a fraction of its potential energy. This is where the genius and the horror of the design become apparent. The gun mechanism is designed to drive the two masses together with such force that they will stay together for the tiny fraction of time needed. Additionally, the bomb contains neutron initiators, devices designed to flood the combined uranium mass with neutrons at precisely the right moment to ensure the chain reaction begins immediately. The first uranium nucleus splits. This happens not because of the initiators, but because of spontaneous fission, a natural if rare occurrence in uranium-235. One nucleus, somewhere in that combined mass of uranium, happens to decay at precisely this moment. It splits, releasing energy and 2 or 3 neutrons. These neutrons, traveling at 20,000 kilometers per hour, immediately strike nearby uranium nuclei. Those nuclei split. More energy is released. More neutrons fly outward. The process doubles. Then doubles again. Then again. Each generation of fission takes approximately 10 nanoseconds, 10 billionths of a second. After 80 generations, in roughly 1 microsecond, a significant fraction of the uranium has undergone fission. The energy released is staggering. Albert Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc2, describes the relationship. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. When the strong nuclear, force-binding uranium nuclei together is released, a tiny amount of mass is converted into a vast amount of energy. Less than 1 kilogram of uranium-235 undergoes fission in Little Boy, but that kilogram releases energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of high explosive. This is not chemical energy, the breaking and reforming of molecular bonds. This is nuclear energy, the fundamental forces that hold atoms together, unleashed in a fraction of a second. The temperature at the center of the weapon reaches several million degrees Celsius in the first microsecond. This is hotter than the surface of the sun. The bomb casing vaporizes instantly. The air surrounding the weapon is superheated and compressed into a sphere of plasma, a fourth state of matter where electrons are stripped from atoms. This fireball, incandescent and expanding at tremendous speed, is the physical manifestation of the weapon's power. At 1/100th of a second after detonation, the fireball is approximately 100 feet in diameter. It continues to expand rapidly, driven by the tremendous pressure of the hot gases and plasma at its core. The temperature at the surface of the fireball is approximately 7,700 degrees Celsius, hot enough to vaporize any organic or inorganic material it encounters. The weapon is floating in midair, 1,900 feet above the ground, when it detonates. This altitude has been carefully calculated. If the bomb explodes too high, its energy will dissipate before reaching the ground. If it explodes on impact with the ground, much of its energy will be absorbed by the Earth, creating a crater but limiting the radius of destruction. But at an altitude of roughly 2,000 feet, the blast wave will reflect off the ground and reinforce the downward traveling wave, creating what weapons designers call a Mach stem effect that maximizes destruction over the widest possible area. The Enola Gay, despite its evasive maneuvers and diving turn, is still within range when the shockwave reaches it. The distance is now approximately 11.5 miles, and the crew braces for impact. When it hits, a sudden buffeting that Paul Tibbets and co-pilot Robert Lewis feel through the control yoke. It's powerful enough that Lewis will later describe it as feeling like the aircraft was being beaten with a baseball bat. But they survive. The plane was designed to survive. Here's something the crew will struggle with for the rest of their lives. From their vantage point, 11 miles away, and climbing, they witness what they've created. Co-pilot Robert Lewis, staring at the mushroom cloud rising to 45,000 feet, writes in his log, "My God, what have we done?" But Tibbets, the commander, expresses no such doubt, at least not publicly. Years later, he will say he never lost a night's sleep over Hiroshima. This divergence in reactions, the horror and the certainty existing simultaneously in the same aircraft, encapsulates the moral complexity that will haunt the decision for decades. From the ground perspective, the mushroom cloud appears as a towering column of darkness blocking out the sun. From above, the Enola Gay crew sees it as a purple-gray mass shot through with fire, boiling upward like something alive. Both perspectives are true. Both are incomplete. The blast wave, the physical shock wave of compressed air, travels much more slowly. Near the point of explosion, this shock wave moves at supersonic speed, faster than the speed of sound in air, but it rapidly decelerates as it expands outward. At the moment of detonation, the pressure at the center of the fireball is millions of times normal atmospheric pressure. This pressure differential creates the shock wave, a wall of compressed air that propagates outward like a three-dimensional ripple on a pond. The explosion also releases various forms of radiation. The nuclear chain reaction produces gamma rays, high-energy photons that can penetrate deep into matter. It produces neutrons, uncharged particles that can travel long distances through air and cause other materials to become radioactive through a process called neutron activation. It produces X-rays and ultraviolet radiation. All of these forms of energy are released in the first microsecond of the explosion and begin racing outward at or near the speed of light. This is the moment of zero. This is the instant when the ordinary laws of human scale and human time are overwhelmed by forces that exist on the atomic level, but have been magnified to a scale where they can affect an entire city. A single nucleus splitting has been amplified through chain reaction into a city-destroying weapon. The tiny binding energy holding protons and neutrons together in uranium nuclei has been converted into heat and light and blast pressure sufficient to kill 80,000 people in 1 minute. In Hiroshima, at ground level, people do not yet know what has happened. The light has not yet reached them. The heat has not yet reached them. The radiation has not yet reached them. The blast wave has not yet reached them. For a few more microseconds, the city exists in its last moment of normalcy, unaware that the instrument of its destruction has just been activated 1,900 feet overhead. The fireball continues to expand. By 0.2 of a second after detonation, it has reached its maximum size, 900 feet in diameter. This ball of incandescent plasma hangs in the air above Hiroshima, like a miniature sun, radiating heat and light in all directions. The surface temperature has dropped slightly to approximately 7,000 degrees Celsius, but this is still hot enough to ignite paper and cloth at distances of over 2 miles. The energy released by the explosion is divided roughly as follows. Approximately 50% becomes blast energy, the shock wave of compressed air. About 35% becomes thermal energy, heat and light. About 15% becomes various forms of nuclear radiation, including gamma rays, neutrons, X-rays, and other ionizing radiation. The exact proportions vary depending on the design of the weapon and the conditions of the explosion, but these percentages are typical for a fission weapon of this type. The first second, light and heat. The flash arrives first. This is what survivors will remember most vividly. The light. They will describe it in various ways, each account trying to capture something that defies ordinary description. It was like a magnesium flash, some will say, like a sheet of sun, like a giant camera bulb exploding across the sky, like nothing they had ever seen or could have imagined. The color descriptions vary. White, blue-white, yellow, orange, yellow mixed with khaki and orange. Many will say simply that everything went completely white, as if the world had been erased and replaced with pure, burning light. The flash lasts less than 1 second. But in that brief moment, more energy is delivered to the surface of Hiroshima than would normally arrive from the sun in days or weeks. The thermal radiation pulse, traveling at the speed of light, takes approximately 3/100ths of a second to travel from the fireball to the ground beneath it. During those 3/100ths of a second, the fireball is at its maximum temperature and brightness. It bathes the city in infrared, visible, and ultraviolet radiation with an intensity that is difficult to comprehend. At the hypocenter, the point on the ground directly beneath the detonation, the heat flux is approximately 100 calories per square centimeter. To put this in perspective, a single calorie is the amount of heat needed to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. 100 calories per square centimeter is enough to instantly vaporize human tissue. People standing in the open within 500 meters of the hypocenter simply cease to exist. They are vaporized, their bodies converted to gas and dust in a fraction of a second. Later, investigators will find shadows on walls and streets, dark patches where human bodies block the thermal radiation for a brief instant before being consumed. These shadows will become one of the most haunting pieces of evidence from the bombing. On the steps of the Sumitomo Bank, approximately 250 meters from the hypocenter, investigators will find the shadow of a person who had been sitting on the steps when the bomb exploded. Here's what happened in that fraction of a second. The person was vaporized, converted to gas and atoms, but their body blocked the thermal radiation long enough to protect the stone beneath them. Where the body existed, the stone stayed relatively light. Where it didn't, the intense radiation scorched it dark. The person was erased. Only their shadow remained, a ghost etched in stone. This silhouette would suggest they were sitting, calmly, perhaps resting on a hot morning when they simply ceased to exist. One moment, a person with thoughts, memories, a life. The next, a shadow. Beyond the immediate hypocenter, the effects of the thermal pulse are catastrophic, but not instantly lethal. The intensity of thermal radiation decreases with distance, according to the inverse square law, but it remains dangerously high for surprising distances. At 1 kilometer from the hypocenter, people standing in the open receive third-degree burns over their entire bodies. Their skin blisters and chars. The pattern of burns often reflects what they were wearing. Dark clothing absorbs more thermal radiation and causes worse burns than light-colored clothing. Patterns on fabric are burned onto skin. One woman will later show doctors how the dark flowers printed on her kimono left flower-shaped burns on her body. At 1.5 kilometers from the hypocenter, people still receive severe burns on exposed skin. The thermal pulse is powerful enough to ignite paper and dry wood at distances of up to 2 miles. Thin wooden structures begin to smolder. Thatched roofs catch fire. Dark painted surfaces scorch. The heat is selective in a way that seems almost arbitrary. A white concrete wall might remain cool while a black painted fence beside it bursts into flames. A person wearing a white shirt might suffer less severe burns than someone standing next to them wearing dark clothing. The thermal radiation is not uniform in its effects because it can be blocked by intervening objects. People inside buildings are partially shielded. The walls absorb some of the thermal energy before it can reach them. People who happen to be in the shadow of a building or hill when the flash occurs are spared the direct thermal radiation. But for those in the open, facing the fireball, the thermal pulse strikes with the force of a blast furnace. Akiko Takakura, the 20-year-old bank employee who had just begun her morning routine, is standing at her desk in the Bank of Hiroshima when the flash occurs. The building is only 300 meters from the hypocenter, well within the zone where almost no one survives. But Akiko happens to be facing away from the window when the bomb explodes. The flash illuminates the room in a brilliant white light that she perceives even though she is not looking directly at it. She will later describe it as like a white magnesium flash. In the next instant, the building collapses, but she will survive. One of the very few people within 300 meters of the hypocenter to live through the first minute. Reverend Tanimoto, standing in his friend's garden 2 miles from the hypocenter, sees the flash as a tremendous sheet of light that cuts across the sky from east to west, from the city toward the hills. It seemed a sheet of sun. The brightness is such that it seems to erase all depth and detail from the landscape for a moment. Then his survival instincts take over. He has, perhaps 2 or 3 seconds before the blast wave arrives. He throws himself between 2 large rocks in the garden, seeking whatever cover they might provide. The thermal radiation has another effect that is less immediately apparent but equally deadly. It ignites fires. These fires begin in 2 ways. Primary fires are started directly by the thermal pulse. Paper, cloth, dry wood, anything easily combustible that is exposed to the intense heat bursts into flame. These primary fires number in the hundreds, scattered throughout the area where the thermal pulse has sufficient intensity to cause ignition. Secondary fires are caused by the destruction itself. When buildings collapse, they knock over cooking fires, rupture gas lines, sever electrical connections, spill flammable liquids. These secondary fires will spread and eventually merge with the primary fires to create a firestorm that will burn for hours. But we are still in the first second. The thermal pulse has delivered its energy. The light has flashed and faded. The immediate burns have been inflicted. And now, traveling at the same speed as the light, arriving at the same instant, comes something invisible and insidious. Radiation. Seconds 1 to 3. The radiation pulse. Here's perhaps the cruelest thing about nuclear weapons. They kill you in ways you can't see, feel, or know about until it's too late. While the flash blinds and the heat burns, injuries you can comprehend, something else is happening. Invisible, silent, deadly. Unlike the flash of light and wave of heat that survivors can see and feel, radiation arrives as a silent assault on human tissue at the cellular level. This is what makes nuclear weapons uniquely horrifying. Conventional explosives kill through blast and fire. You know if you're hurt. Radiation damages the fundamental machinery of life itself, and you won't know you're dying until days or weeks later. Picture this. A man stands 1 kilometer from the hypocenter. The blast wave knocks him down, but doesn't kill him. The thermal pulse burns his skin, but not deeply enough to be fatal. He picks himself up, dusts himself off, and thinks, I survived. I'm going to be okay. He doesn't know that gamma rays have already passed through him, that his bone marrow is dying, that in 2 weeks, he'll be dead, regardless of how well his visible injuries heal. The radiation that killed him was invisible, painless, and has already finished its work. He's dead. He just doesn't know it yet. The radiation released by the Hiroshima bomb consists primarily of gamma rays and neutrons, both produced by the fission reactions occurring in the brief moment when the uranium nuclei are splitting. These are ionizing radiation, meaning they carry enough energy to strip electrons from atoms, creating charged particles called ions. When this ionization happens inside living tissue, it causes damage that can kill cells, disrupt organ function, and alter DNA in ways that can lead to cancer years or decades later. Gamma rays are photons, packets of electromagnetic energy like visible light, but with much higher energy and frequency. They travel at the speed of light. They can penetrate deeply into matter, passing through walls, flesh, bone. A gamma ray entering a human body might pass completely through without interacting with anything, or it might collide with an atom, transferring its energy and causing ionization. The body has no defense against gamma rays. You cannot see them, feel them, smell them, or hear them. They simply pass through you. And if enough of them interact with your cells, you will begin to die in ways that will not be immediately apparent. Neutrons are particles with no electric charge, slightly more massive than protons. Like gamma rays, they can penetrate deeply into matter. Unlike gamma rays, neutrons can cause other materials to become radioactive through a process called neutron activation. When a neutron is absorbed by a stable atom, it can convert that atom into an unstable isotope that will then decay, releasing more radiation. This means that neutrons not only cause immediate damage, but can also make materials around them radioactive, creating lingering contamination. The amount of radiation a person receives depends primarily on their distance from the hypocenter and whether they have any shielding between themselves and the bomb. The radiation pulse from the Hiroshima bomb lasted approximately 1 second, traveling outward in all directions from the fireball. At the hypocenter, the radiation dose was lethal many times over. But this is academic, because anyone there was killed instantly by the thermal pulse. At greater distances, the radiation dose decreases, but remains dangerous to surprising distances. At 500 meters from the hypocenter, people receive doses of approximately 10 to 20 gray of radiation. A gray is a unit measuring absorbed radiation dose, defined as 1 joule of radiation energy absorbed per kilogram of matter. To put this in context, a whole body dose of 4 to 5 gray will kill about half of the people exposed within 30 to 60 days if they receive no medical treatment. This is called the LD50, or lethal dose for 50% of the population. A dose of 10 to 20 gray is far above this threshold. People receiving this much radiation will die within days or weeks, even if they survive the immediate blast and heat effects. At 1 kilometer from the hypocenter, the radiation dose drops to approximately 1 to 2 gray. This is still a dangerous dose, capable of causing acute radiation syndrome, though not immediately lethal in most cases. At 1.5 kilometers, the dose is measured in hundreds of milligray, enough to cause some radiation sickness, but generally survivable. At 2 kilometers and beyond, the radiation dose from the initial burst is relatively low, though still measurable and still capable of increasing cancer risk over the long term. The radiation does its damage at the cellular level through several mechanisms. When ionizing radiation passes through living tissue, it can directly damage critical molecules like DNA. A gamma ray or neutron might strike a DNA molecule and break one or both of its strands. If the damage is severe enough and occurs in enough cells, tissues and organs begin to fail. The body's most rapidly dividing cells are particularly vulnerable. This includes the cells of the bone marrow, which produce blood cells, the cells lining the gastrointestinal tract, and the cells of hair follicles. The radiation can also cause indirect damage through a process involving free radicals. When radiation ionizes water molecules inside cells, it creates highly reactive free radicals that then go on to damage other molecules, including DNA, proteins, and lipids. This cascade of damage can continue for hours or days after the initial radiation exposure, causing cumulative harm that exceeds the immediate direct effects. Different types of tissue have different sensitivity to radiation. The most sensitive are tissues with rapidly dividing cells: bone marrow, digestive tract lining, reproductive organs, and the lymphatic system. Slightly less sensitive but still vulnerable are the skin, the lungs, and the crystalline lens of the eye. The least sensitive are tissues with slowly dividing cells: bones, muscles, and nerves. This means that radiation exposure manifests differently depending on the dose and the tissues affected. For those who receive high doses of radiation in Hiroshima, the effects follow a pattern that doctors will come to recognize, though at first they won't understand what they're seeing. In the first hours and days, victims experience nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and fatigue, the prodromal phase of what will later be termed acute radiation syndrome. Then, remarkably, many of them improve. This latent phase creates cruel hope. They think they're recovering, They believe they've survived the worst. Days pass, sometimes weeks. They feel better. They begin to think about rebuilding their lives. Then the manifest illness phase begins. Based on what medical researchers will later document, the progression appears to follow a brutal timeline. Blood cell production drops as bone marrow cells die. White blood cell counts fall, leaving victims vulnerable to any infection. Red blood cell counts drop, causing severe anemia. Platelet counts plummet, leading to uncontrollable bleeding. Hair falls out in clumps. Lesions appear on the skin and inside the mouth. The person weakens, day by day, until their body simply gives up. This pattern will repeat in thousands of victims, teaching doctors hard lessons about radiation that no amount of laboratory research could have prepared them for. But this is all in the future. In this first second after the radiation pulse arrives, people do not yet know they have been exposed. The gamma rays and neutrons have passed through them, damaging their cells, but there is no immediate pain or sensation. A person standing 1 kilometer from the hypocenter might be more concerned about the terrible burns they just received from the thermal pulse. They do not yet know that their bone marrow is already beginning to die, that they have received a dose of radiation that will kill them in 2 weeks, regardless of how well their burns heal. The radiation is particularly insidious because it offers no warning and leaves no immediate trace. A person who is inside a building with thick walls might feel lucky to have been shielded from the blast and heat, not realizing that gamma rays and neutrons penetrated those walls and delivered a still dangerous dose of radiation. A person who ran outside after the explosion to help others might not know they are walking through areas of neutron-activated material that will add to their cumulative dose. The radiation also has long-term effects that will not appear for years or decades. Damage to DNA can cause mutations that lead to cancer. People exposed to the Hiroshima bomb will experience elevated rates of leukemia beginning about 2 years after the bombing, with the incidence peaking around 4 to 6 years later. Other cancers, solid tumors of various types, will begin appearing about 10 years after the bombing and will continue at elevated rates for the rest of the survivors' lives. Children are particularly vulnerable to radiation. Their cells are dividing more rapidly than adults' cells, which makes them more susceptible to radiation damage. Children exposed in utero show increased rates of intellectual disability and growth impairment. Children who were young at the time of the bombing show higher cancer rates than adults who received similar doses. But again, all of this is in the future. In the first 3 seconds after the bomb explodes, the radiation pulse has been delivered. It has passed through the city, through walls and bodies, leaving damage in its wake. The people of Hiroshima do not yet understand what has happened to them. They are about to face more immediate threats. The blast wave is coming. Seconds 3 to 10. The shockwave arrives. The shockwave is the most familiar form of destruction because it resembles, at least superficially, the effects of conventional explosives. But the scale is vastly different. A typical 500-pound high-explosive bomb creates a shockwave with a lethal radius of perhaps 50 to 100 feet. The shockwave from Little Boy will destroy buildings and kill people at distances measured in miles. The shockwave travels much more slowly than light and heat, but it is still moving at tremendous speed. Near the hypocenter, the shockwave is traveling faster than the speed of sound, perhaps 1,000 meters per second or more. This is true supersonic speed, faster than a rifle bullet. As it expands outward, the shockwave decelerates, eventually slowing to the speed of sound in air, about 340 meters per second. But even at this slower speed, it arrives with devastating force. The shockwave is not simply air moving quickly. It is a region of overpressure, where the air is compressed to a density much higher than normal atmospheric pressure. Think of it as a wall of compressed air, traveling outward from the explosion in an expanding sphere. When this wall hits an object, the object experiences a sudden, violent increase in pressure on the side facing the explosion, followed milliseconds later by a sudden decrease in pressure as the wave passes. This pressure differential can tear structures apart, snap steel beams, and hurl objects through the air like leaves in a hurricane. At the hypocenter, directly beneath the point of detonation, the peak overpressure is approximately 11 tons per square meter, or about 35 pounds per square inch above normal atmospheric pressure. To understand what this means, imagine that every square inch of every surface is suddenly being pressed upon with an additional force of 35 pounds. For a human body, this crushing force is instantly lethal. Bones shatter, organs rupture. But again, this is academic because everyone at the hypocenter has already been killed by the thermal pulse. At 500 meters from the hypocenter, the peak overpressure is still approximately 11 tons per square meter. This is the region of total destruction. Wooden buildings are smashed flat. Reinforced concrete buildings remain standing, but are severely damaged, their interiors gutted, all windows blown out. Internal walls and floors collapsed. The few structures that survive in recognizable form are those built with exceptional strength because of earthquake codes. These buildings, their reinforced concrete frames designed to flex and absorb seismic energy, can partially withstand the blast. But their interiors are destroyed. Fires will later consume whatever remains. The shockwave does not arrive instantaneously across the entire city. It expands outward, taking several seconds to cover distances of kilometers. People at different locations experience the blast at different times, separated by seconds that mark the difference between life and death. Those further from the hypocenter have a few precious seconds of warning after seeing the flash. Some drop to the ground. Some throw themselves behind objects or into ditches. Some do nothing, frozen by incomprehension. These split-second decisions and random circumstances determine who lives and who dies. Akiko Takakura, inside the bank of Hiroshima at 300 meters from the hypocenter, is facing away from the window when the flash occurs. The thermal pulse does not directly burn her. Then, less than a second later, the shock wave hits. The building, despite its reinforced concrete construction, suffers catastrophic damage. Walls crumble. The roof collapses. Akiko is thrown to the ground and buried under debris, loses consciousness. Later, she will discover over 100 lacerated wounds on her back from flying debris and falling masonry. But she is alive, one of the very few people within 300 meters of the hypocenter who will survive the next hour. At distances of 1 kilometer, the shockwave arrives approximately 3 seconds after the flash. The peak overpressure here is about 2 to 3 pounds per square inch, enough to shatter all windows, severely damage wooden structures, and knock people off their feet. A person standing in the open experiences the shockwave as a sudden, violent wind accompanied by a deafening roar. They are picked up and thrown through the air, tumbling, striking the ground or buildings or other objects. Many die from the impact. Others are trapped under collapsed buildings. Beyond 1 kilometer, the shockwave weakens but remains dangerous. At 1.5 kilometers, wooden houses are damaged, but not completely destroyed. Roof tiles are blown off. Windows shatter. At 2 kilometers, the damage is less severe, but still significant. People are knocked down, but not generally killed by the blast alone, though many are injured by flying glass and debris. The shockwave has another effect that is less obvious, but equally deadly. When it hits a structure, some of the energy is reflected back, creating a complex pattern of constructive and destructive interference. Where the initial shockwave and the reflected wave reinforce each other, the pressure is higher than either wave alone. Where they cancel, the pressure is lower. This creates unpredictable pockets of destruction, where some buildings collapse while neighbors remain standing. It also means that ground-level structures experience different forces than those at higher elevations, and that structures near walls or embankments experience different pressures than those in open areas. After the initial shockwave passes, there is a second effect, the suction phase. The explosion creates a region of extremely low pressure at its center as the hot gases rush outward. Air from surrounding areas rushes back toward this low pressure zone, creating winds that blow in the opposite direction of the initial shockwave. This reverse wind can be strong enough to knock down buildings that survived the initial blast, and it fans fires by supplying fresh oxygen. The sound of the explosion, the actual acoustic wave, is part of this shock front, but curiously, many survivors at close range report not hearing the explosion clearly or at all. This is because at very close ranges, the overpressure is severe enough to cause immediate ear damage, rupturing eardrums and damaging the delicate structures of the inner ear. The survivors are deafened before they can process the sound. At greater distances, the sound is described as a tremendous roar or rumble, like thunder but far louder and more sustained. Reverend Tanemoto, 2 miles from the hypocenter, has the flash, recognizes danger, and throws himself between 2 rocks before the shockwave arrives. He has perhaps 3 seconds. When the shockwave hits, he feels a sudden pressure, and then splinters and pieces of board and fragments of tile fell on him. The house has collapsed. The concrete wall around the garden has collapsed. He is buried under debris, but alive. He will spend the next hours and days helping survivors, becoming one of the key figures in relief efforts. The shockwave demolishes approximately 90% of the buildings within 2 kilometers of the hypocenter. This includes thousands of traditional wooden houses, hundreds of shops and workshops, schools, temples, shrines, government buildings. Only a handful of reinforced concrete structures remain standing, and even these are hollow shells, their interiors destroyed by fire and blast. The city's infrastructure is wrecked. Water mains rupture. Gas lines break. Electrical wires are torn down. Bridges are damaged or destroyed. Roads are blocked by rubble. The blast wave also creates a massive dust cloud. Pulverized wood, tile, plaster, and stone are thrown into the air, creating a dense pall that turns the city dark even though the sun is shining. This dust cloud will persist for hours, reducing visibility and making rescue efforts more difficult. It also contributes to later radiation exposure, as dust particles contaminated with neutron-activated materials settle on people and objects. By the 10-second mark, the shock wave has expanded outward to approximately 3 kilometers in all directions. Beyond this radius, the blast effects are relatively minor. Broken windows, minor structural damage, people knocked down, but not seriously injured. The shockwave will continue expanding, weakening as it goes, eventually becoming merely a loud noise audible for dozens of miles. But within that 3-kilometer radius, the destruction is nearly total. Seconds, 10 to 30, fire ignites the city. By 10 seconds after detonation, hundreds of fires are burning in Hiroshima. Some were ignited directly by the thermal pulse in the first second after the explosion. Others have been started by secondary causes. Overturned charcoal cooking fires, ruptured gas lines, severed electrical wires, flammable materials brought into contact with hot surfaces. These fires, initially scattered and isolated, will soon begin to merge into a larger conflagration that will consume much of the city. The primary fires, those started directly by the thermal radiation, are concentrated in the area closest to the hypocenter, where the thermal pulse was most intense. Within 1 kilometer of the hypocenter, dark-colored wooden surfaces were heated to ignition temperature almost instantaneously. Paper screens caught fire. Thatched roofs smoldered and then burst into flame. Dark painted wood charred and began to burn. These fires started simultaneously across a wide area, creating hundreds of points of ignition in the first second after the flash. The pattern of primary fire ignition is strangely selective. A cedar bark roof and a dry wooden platform located approximately 1.6 kilometers west of the hypocenter were reported to have been ignited directly by the thermal flash. But white painted surfaces and concrete-faced structures reflected enough of the thermal radiation to avoid ignition. This creates a random-seeming pattern where some buildings burn while their neighbors do not, where one side of a street is aflame while the other is merely scorched. Secondary fires are even more numerous. The shockwave, arriving seconds after the thermal pulse, has collapsed thousands of buildings. Inside those buildings were cooking fires, charcoal braziers still smoldering from breakfast preparations. When the buildings collapsed, these fires were scattered through the rubble, igniting wood and fabric. The shockwave also ruptured gas lines throughout the city. Natural gas, used for cooking and heating, began pouring into the wreckage and igniting wherever it encountered a spark or flame. Electrical systems were destroyed, creating short circuits that produced sparks and heat. Industrial facilities with furnaces and process fires were demolished, scattering hot coals and molten material. The city is ideally configured for fire to spread. Most of the buildings are wooden construction with tile roofs. The wooden walls and floors are dry from the summer heat. The buildings are closely spaced in many neighborhoods, separated by only a few feet in some cases. The shockwave has collapsed these buildings into each other, creating continuous paths of combustible material. The reverse wind following the shockwave has supplied fresh oxygen to the fires, turning smoldering ruins into active conflagrations. By 20 seconds after detonation, the separate fires are beginning to merge. Fire spreads from building to building, jumping gaps, carried by burning embers blown on the wind. The heat from one burning structure ignites the adjacent structure. Radiant heat from large fires is sufficient to cause spontaneous ignition of combustible materials at distances of several meters. What began as hundreds of isolated fires is becoming a connected network of flames, spreading through the central district of the city. The fires create their own wind patterns. Hot air rises from the flames, creating areas of low pressure that draw in cooler air from surrounding areas. This movement of air, combined with the wind patterns established by the shockwave and the reverse suction, creates chaotic and shifting gusts that make the behavior of the fire unpredictable. In some areas, fires merge and intensify. In others, they burn in isolation. The topography of the city, with its rivers and occasional hills, creates wind tunnels and barriers that channel the flames in particular directions. People trapped in collapsed buildings face a terrible choice. Many are pinned under debris, unable to move. They can hear the fires approaching, can feel the heat intensifying, can see the smoke growing thicker. Those who can move must decide whether to stay and try to free trapped family members or to flee and save themselves. Many choose to stay, attempting to lift beams and clear rubble with their bare hands. Some succeed in freeing trapped loved ones. Others die beside them when the fires arrive. The fires also threaten people who survived the blast relatively unharmed. A person who was outdoors at the moment of the explosion might have been knocked down by the shockwave, but not seriously injured. But now they find themselves surrounded by fire on multiple sides, with smoke filling the air. Visibility dropping to meters. They must navigate through burning streets, over rubble, around craters, seeking escape routes that change moment by moment as new fires ignite and existing fires spread. Water is everywhere and nowhere. The city is built on a river delta with 7 channels of the Oda River flowing through it. Under normal circumstances, water is abundant. But the shockwave and subsequent fires have created such chaos that reaching the river is difficult or impossible for many people. Rubble blocks streets. Collapsed bridges make crossing impossible. Fires cut off access routes. People can see the river but cannot reach it. Those who do manage to get to the water find it crowded with others seeking the same relief. The fires also create secondary casualties through smoke inhalation. As wooden structures burn, they produce thick, toxic smoke containing carbon monoxide, particulates, and other noxious gases. People seeking shelter in partially collapsed buildings find themselves trapped in smoke-filled spaces. They become disoriented, unable to find exits, and suffocate. Others who survive the fire itself die from smoke inhalation damage to their lungs in the hours and days that follow. By 30 seconds after detonation, the fire situation in Hiroshima is becoming catastrophic. What had been hundreds of separate fires is coalescing into a massive urban conflagration. The area within 1 kilometer of the hypocenter is almost entirely on fire. At greater distances, fires are scattered but spreading. The smoke is rising in a vast column, darkening the sky, mixing with the dust and debris to create an oppressive, choking atmosphere. The temperature within burning buildings reaches lethal levels within minutes. Fire spreads through the wreckage with terrifying speed, often faster than people can move through the debris. Wooden structures burn completely, leaving only scorched earth and the skeletal remains of a few concrete foundations. The intense heat causes strange effects. Metals melt and fuse together. Roof tiles melt and flow like lava. Stone and concrete crack and crumble. Glass melts into pools and ribbons. Approximately 13,700 feet from the hypocenter, the most distant fire definitively attributed to the atomic bomb has been documented. This fire likely started when a building with a thatched roof collapsed onto a hot charcoal fire. Even at this distance, more than 2.5 miles from ground zero, the destructive effects of the bomb are still causing fires. The thermal pulse alone extends to approximately 3.5 kilometers. Hot enough to cause flash burns on exposed skin, though not generally hot enough to directly ignite most materials at that range. The fires in Hiroshima will continue to burn and spread for hours after the initial explosion. They will peak between 10 in the morning and 2 or 3 in the afternoon, when the fires from different districts merge into a single massive firestorm. The firestorm creates its own weather, with powerful winds drawn in from the periphery toward the center, feeding the flames with fresh oxygen and spreading embers to new areas. The entire city will appear to be burning, with smoke visible for dozens of miles. The heat will be intense enough that people more than a mile from the hypocenter will feel as though they are in a furnace. The fires will not fully die out until late in the day or the next morning, by which time most of the city's wooden structures will have been reduced to ash and charcoal. Hasat. Seconds 30 to 60. The human experience. In the 30 seconds between the explosion and the 1-minute mark, human beings throughout Hiroshima experience the full horror of what has happened. For those closest to the hypocenter, there is no experience at all. Death comes instantly. But for those further out, in the rings of destruction that extend for miles, the next 30 seconds are a descent into hell. Akiko Takakura regains consciousness in darkness, buried under the collapsed bank of Hiroshima. She is bleeding from over 100 wounds on her back where flying glass and debris have shredded her. But she is alive. 300 meters from an atomic explosion, inside a zone where almost everyone dies, she is alive. The reason comes down to angles and physics. She was facing away from the windows when the flash came. That random orientation saved her from the direct thermal pulse that would have burned her to death. The thick walls of the reinforced concrete bank building absorbed the worst of the blast wave, and the debris that collapsed on top of her, while injuring her terribly, created a pocket that kept her from being crushed. 1,000 tiny coincidences aligned to save her life. A slightly different position, a different time of day when she might have been at a window. Any of a dozen small changes, and she would have been among the 80,000 dead. She digs herself out. Her hands find wooden beams, concrete chunks, shattered glass. She pushes debris aside, creates space, moves toward where she thinks the exit might be. When she finally emerges from the ruins, she sees something her mind cannot process. The city is gone. Not damaged, not burning, gone. Where? Hiroshima had stood 1 minute ago. There is now only smoke, fire, and ruins stretching in every direction. And people, thousands of people, wandering like ghosts through the devastation. But they don't look like people anymore. At greater distances from the hypocenter, people who were indoors or shielded from the direct thermal pulse have different but equally traumatic experiences. A person who was in the basement of a building when the bomb exploded might have avoided the thermal burns and been partially protected from the blast. But when they try to leave, they find the building has collapsed around them. The stairways are blocked. The exits are buried. They are trapped in darkness with no way to know what has happened or when help might come. Some will find their way out. Others will die in place as the fires approach and the smoke thickens. A child who was playing in a schoolyard when the flash occurred might have been knocked unconscious by the shockwave. When they wake up, perhaps 30 seconds later, they cannot understand what has happened. Where are their friends? Where are the teachers? The school building is collapsed or burning. Bodies lie on the ground. The child begins to cry, calling for their mother, but no one comes. They start to walk, joining the streams of injured people flowing away from the city center, not knowing where they are going, only knowing that they need to move. Reverend Tanemoto, 2 miles from the hypocenter, has survived the initial blast, protected by the rocks he threw himself between. He emerges to find his friend's house destroyed and the city in flames. From his vantage point in the suburbs, he can see the entire city center covered in fire and smoke. The scene is apocalyptic. He makes a decision that will define the rest of his day, and, in many ways, the rest of his life. He will go into the city to help. He begins walking toward the destruction, against the flow of people fleeing from it. By 45 seconds after detonation, the first survivors are beginning to move in organized ways. Though organized is perhaps too strong a word. There is no order, no authority, no plan. Individual people make individual decisions based on instinct, and whatever fragments of understanding they can piece together. Some move toward where they think help might be found. Hospitals, police stations, military barracks. But most of these facilities have been destroyed or damaged, their staff killed or wounded. Those that remain standing are quickly overwhelmed by casualties. The rivers become gathering places. People flee to the water seeking relief from burns, seeking to escape the fires, seeking any kind of safety in a landscape where nowhere is safe. They wade into the shallows. They splash water on their burns. They help others who are too weak to reach the water alone. But the rivers, too, become places of death. People weaken by radiation, and burns lose consciousness in the water and drown. Bodies begin to accumulate along the banks and in the shallows. At military facilities, soldiers who were conducting morning exercises on parade grounds have been killed in large numbers. At Hiroshima Castle, where elements of the 2nd General Army headquarters were undergoing physical training, the bomb kills approximately 3,243 troops. They were lined up in formation, exposed in the open, when the thermal pulse and shockwave hit. Those who survive are often among the most severely injured, with both burn injuries and radiation exposure. Some attempt to maintain military discipline, trying to organize rescue efforts or evacuate their units. Others simply collapse. In hospitals throughout the affected area, the medical staff becomes casualties themselves. Approximately 90% of doctors and 93% of nurses in Hiroshima are killed or injured. Most of them because the hospitals were located in the downtown area that received the most severe damage. The few medical personnel who survive find themselves overwhelmed by casualties beyond anything they could have imagined or prepared for. One doctor, Terufumi Sasaki, at the Red Cross Hospital, will later become known as one of the few physicians who remained on duty and provided care to thousands of patients in the days that followed. But in this first minute, even he is struggling to understand the scale of what has happened. By 1 minute after detonation, the survivors are beginning to grasp that something unprecedented has occurred. They do not yet know what kind of weapon was used. Many think it must have been multiple bombs dropped simultaneously, because how else could the entire city be destroyed at once? Some think it was some kind of gasoline bomb or incendiary attack. A few, familiar with physics and radiation, begin to suspect the truth, but can hardly believe it. The term atomic bomb will not become widely known in Hiroshima for hours or days, not until the American government makes its announcement and Japanese authorities begin to investigate. The death toll in this first minute is staggering. Approximately 80,000 people have been killed outright, or so grievously injured that they will not survive the day. This includes those vaporized at the hypocenter, those killed by the thermal pulse within 1 kilometer, those crushed in collapsed buildings, those burned beyond recovery, those who received lethal doses of radiation, even though they appear uninjured. Another 80,000 to 100,000 are injured, some severely, some moderately, but all needing medical care that largely does not exist. The immediate dead include people from all walks of life, office workers at their desks, students demolishing buildings to create fire breaks, mothers preparing breakfast, children walking to school, soldiers on parade grounds, factory workers at their machines, shop owners opening their stores, doctors and nurses in hospitals, police officers at their posts, Buddhist monks in temples. Everyone caught in the wrong place at the wrong moment when the bomb exploded overhead. Among the victims are approximately 20,000 Korean forced laborers brought to Hiroshima to work in war industries. These men and women, already suffering under harsh conditions, are disproportionately housed in areas that suffer severe damage. They have no special protection, no warning, no means of escape different from anyone else. They die alongside Japanese civilians, their bodies indistinguishable in the rubble and ash, their deaths often unrecorded or miscounted in official statistics that focus on Japanese casualties. Among the dead are approximately 20 American prisoners of war held in the city. These men, captured during Pacific battles, were brought to Hiroshima for interrogation. When the bomb explodes, they are killed instantly or die shortly after, killed by a weapon created by their own country, dropped by their own military, without anyone in the chain of command knowing they were there. The pilots of the Enola Gay don't know. The scientists who built the bomb don't know. President Truman doesn't know. The terrible irony won't be discovered until later, when investigators begin counting bodies and identifying the dead. This detail, when it emerges, will complicate the already fraught moral questions surrounding the bombing, though by then it will be far too late to matter to the 20 men who died under a mushroom cloud, bearing their own country's insignia. By the 60-second mark, those who can move are beginning to flee the city center. The movement is toward the rivers, toward the hills, toward anywhere that seems less engulfed in flames than where they currently stand. There is no organized evacuation, no emergency services guiding people to safety, no vehicles available to transport the injured. People walk if they can walk. They crawl if they cannot walk. They are carried by those who have the strength to carry them. The exodus from the city will continue for hours, with streams of injured survivors moving like slow-motion rivers through the streets and across the rubble. The living help the dying. Strangers assist strangers. People who are themselves badly injured stop to help those who are worse off. There are acts of extraordinary courage and compassion in this nightmare landscape. A man carries a child who is not his own. A woman shares water from a bucket with a dozen burned victims. Teenagers organize themselves to clear rubble and pull people from collapsed buildings. These small acts of humanity persist even as the fires rage and the death toll climbs. The 60-second mark, a city transformed. At precisely 1 minute after the explosion, Hiroshima is no longer recognizable as the city it was 60 seconds earlier. The transformation is so complete, so total, that survivors will later struggle to describe what they saw. The familiar landmarks that had defined their mental map of the city, the bridges, the castle, the temples, the streets they walked every day, are gone. or rendered unrecognizable. In their place is a landscape of fire, smoke, rubble, and human suffering. The mushroom cloud, which began forming in the first seconds after detonation, has now reached an altitude of approximately 45,000 feet, 3 miles above the altitude of the Enola Gay. The cloud is visible for dozens of miles in all directions, a towering column of smoke and debris that rises into the stratosphere. From the ground, it appears as a massive, boiling darkness that blocks out the sun. From above, from the perspective of the Enola Gay crew flying away at maximum speed, it looks purple and gray, shot through with fire, expanding upward and outward like something alive. Within a radius of 1 mile from the hypocenter, total destruction is the rule. Approximately 67,000 buildings existed in this zone before the bombing. Now they are reduced to rubble and ash. Only a handful of reinforced concrete structures remain standing, and these are hollow shells. Their walls have survived the blast, but their interiors are gutted by fire. Windows are gone, roofs have collapsed, floors have fallen through. These skeletal frames stand among the wreckage like tombstones marking what used to be. The Aioi Bridge, the intended aiming point for the bomb, is damaged but still standing. The T-shaped structure that made it such a distinctive visual reference from the air has been twisted by the blast, but the basic form remains. This bridge, in the coming decades, will become a symbol of the bombing, appearing in photographs and memorials. But on this morning, 1 minute after the explosion, it is simply another damaged structure in a city full of destruction. The Genbaku Dome, which will eventually be preserved as the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, is barely recognizable. The building that once housed the Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall now consists of the dome framework and portions of the outer walls. It is located approximately 160 meters from the hypocenter, close enough that the blast wave struck almost directly downward rather than horizontally, which paradoxically allowed some of the vertical structure to survive while everything around it was obliterated. The building is burning and will continue to burn, but its distinctive dome will remain, becoming the most famous physical remnant of the bombing. The rivers are clogged with debris and bodies. People who jumped or fell into the water seeking relief from burns have drowned. Others who reached the water safely are clustered along the banks, too injured or shocked to move further. The water itself is contaminated with ash, radioactive particles, and the decomposing bodies of fish killed by the shockwave. But for the burned and injured, the water still offers the only immediate relief from their pain. Fires are burning throughout the city in an interconnected web that is rapidly becoming a firestorm. The heat is so intense that it creates its own weather patterns. Cool air rushes in from the periphery to replace the rising hot air, creating powerful winds that spread the flames further. The smoke column rises several miles into the atmosphere, carrying radioactive particles, ash, and debris. This column will eventually create what survivors will later describe as black rain, radioactive precipitation that will fall on areas of the city that were not directly affected by the blast. The darkening of the sky is almost complete in the city center. The combination of smoke, dust, and the shadow of the mushroom cloud has turned what should be a bright summer morning into something like twilight. Visibility is reduced to meters in many areas. The darkness is not uniform. It shifts and changes as the smoke moves, creating moments of brightness followed by deeper darkness. This obscuration will make rescue efforts more difficult and add to the confusion and terror of survivors trying to navigate the wreckage. The physical state of the city at the 1 minute mark defies precise description because the destruction is so extensive and so varied. In some areas, every structure is completely flattened, leaving only scorched earth. In others, walls are still standing, but everything else is gone. In still others, buildings have collapsed into each other, creating massive piles of rubble. The streets are unrecognizable, buried under debris, or simply erased by the complete destruction of everything that defined them. The casualty figures at this 1 minute mark are staggering and almost certainly underestimated. Approximately 80,000 people have been killed or mortally wounded. This represents nearly a quarter of the city's population, killed in 1 minute by one bomb. The figure includes instant deaths from vaporization, thermal burns, blast trauma, and crushing, and near-term deaths from injuries so severe that survival is impossible, even with immediate medical care that is not available. Another 80,000 to 100,000 people are injured, ranging from minor wounds to severe trauma. Many of these people will die in the coming hours, days, and weeks from their injuries, from infections, from radiation sickness, from lack of medical care. The medical infrastructure has been essentially destroyed. Approximately 42 of the city's 45 hospitals are non-functional, either completely destroyed or too damaged to operate. The medical personnel who might staff these hospitals are themselves casualties. In the first minute after the explosion, there is effectively no organized medical response possible. Individual doctors and nurses who survived will begin treating patients as best they can, but they are working without supplies, without facilities, without support. Most of the injured will receive no immediate medical care at all. The city's bones, East said. Emergency services are similarly devastated. Police stations have been destroyed. Fire stations are damaged or burning. The equipment needed for rescue operations, trucks, hoses, axes, medical supplies, is buried in rubble or consumed by fire. The personnel who would operate this equipment are killed or injured. Communication infrastructure is destroyed. Telephone lines are down. Radio stations are off the air. Runners cannot navigate the debris, choked streets. There is no way for authorities to coordinate a response, even if they had the resources to mount one. Transportation infrastructure is severely damaged. Roads are blocked by rubble and fire. Bridges are damaged or destroyed. Train lines are twisted or buried. The harbor facilities are burning. No vehicles can move through the central city. This means that even if help exists somewhere outside the city, medical supplies, rescue personnel, firefighting equipment, there is no way to bring it in. The city is effectively isolated, cut off from assistance, left to cope with the disaster, using only whatever resources survived the blast. The industrial facilities in Hiroshima are destroyed or severely damaged. These facilities, which produced war materials and supported military operations, were one of the reasons Hiroshima was selected as a target. Factories, shipyards, munitions plants, warehouses, all are burning or collapsed. The machinery that filled these buildings is twisted scrap. The workers who operated them are casualties. This destruction will effectively end Hiroshima's contribution to the Japanese war effort, which was one of the stated objectives of the bombing. At this 1-minute mark, the majority of the city's population does not yet understand what has happened. Here's what makes this particularly tragic. They're trying to make sense of the devastation using the only frame of reference they have: conventional bombing. Many survivors, based on their testimonies, believe they've just experienced an enormous conventional raid involving hundreds or thousands of aircraft dropping incendiaries simultaneously. Some think new types of gasoline bombs were used. Others believe multiple bombs fell at the exact same instant across the entire city. The concept of a single bomb destroying an entire city is so far outside human experience in 1945 that even people who witnessed it can't comprehend it. The human mind rejects the impossible, even when the evidence is everywhere. Even military officials, when they first survey the damage, will struggle to believe one weapon did this. The truth will spread slowly over the next hours and days, through rumors, through official investigations, through the American announcement that will eventually reach Japan. But in this first minute, the reality of what just happened is too vast to grasp. The victims of the world's first atomic bombing don't yet know they're victims of an atomic bombing. They only know their world has ended, and they don't know why. The psychological impact of the bombing on survivors will prove nearly as devastating as the physical effects. People who witnessed the flash, the blast, the fires, the suffering, will carry those images for the rest of their lives. Many will develop what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They will have nightmares. They will startle at loud noises. They will fear the sky. They will be unable to function normally for months or years. Some will never fully recover psychologically, even if their physical injuries heal. For the Hibakusha, as survivors will come to be called, the bombing marks a dividing line in their lives, before and after. Everything that came before is remembered as a different world, a world where such things were not possible, where cities could not be destroyed in an instant, where weapons of such power did not exist. Everything that comes after is shadowed by the knowledge that it did happen, that they survived when so many did not, that the world has been fundamentally changed. Understanding the weapon. To fully grasp the horror of the first minute after the Hiroshima bombing, it helps to understand what Little Boy actually was and how it functioned. This weapon represented the culmination of one of the most ambitious and expensive scientific projects in human history, the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project began in 1942, driven by fears that Nazi Germany might develop atomic weapons first. The project brought together some of the most brilliant physicists in the world, including J. Robert Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, Leo Szilard, and many others. It established secret facilities in multiple locations: Los Alamos in New Mexico for weapons design, Oak Ridge in Tennessee for uranium enrichment, Hanford in Washington for plutonium production. At its peak, the project employed over 130,000 people and cost approximately $2 billion, a staggering sum for that era. The theoretical basis for the atomic bomb came from discoveries in nuclear physics made in the 1930s. In 1938, German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann discovered nuclear fission, the process by which a uranium nucleus could be split by bombarding it with neutrons. In 1939, Lise Meitner and Otto Frisch provided the theoretical explanation for this process and recognized its potential for releasing enormous amounts of energy. Leo Szilard realized that fission reactions could create a self-sustaining chain reaction if each fission released more neutrons than it consumed. This was the key insight that made atomic bombs theoretically possible. The challenge was practical rather than theoretical. Building an actual bomb required solving several enormous technical problems. First, scientists needed to obtain enough fissile material, uranium-235 or plutonium-239, to create a critical mass. Natural uranium is mostly uranium-238, which does not fission readily. Only about 0.7% is uranium-235, the isotope needed for a bomb. Separating these isotopes, which are chemically identical and differ only in mass, required developing entirely new technologies. The Manhattan Project pursued multiple approaches simultaneously: gaseous diffusion, electromagnetic separation, thermal diffusion, and centrifuges. Each method was expensive and technically difficult, but together they succeeded in producing enough enriched uranium for a weapon. Little Boy was a gun-type fission bomb, the simpler of the two designs developed by the Manhattan Project. The design consisted of a conventional explosive that fired a uranium projectile down a gun barrel into a uranium target, combining two subcritical masses into one supercritical mass. Once critical mass was achieved, a burst of neutrons would initiate the chain reaction. The design was straightforward enough that the scientists were confident it would work without testing it first. The only full-scale test of a gun-type weapon was the use of Little Boy itself over Hiroshima. The bomb contained approximately 64 kilograms of uranium-235, of which less than 1 kilogram actually underwent fission before the bomb blew itself apart. This inefficiency might seem like a design flaw, but it was an acceptable trade-off for a weapon that was almost certain to work. The uranium was extremely expensive to produce, but the United States had a limited supply and could not afford to waste it on a weapon that might fail. The gun-type design, while inefficient, was reliable. The weapon was 10 feet long and 28 inches in diameter, weighing approximately 10,000 pounds. It was too long to fit in a standard B-29 bomb bay, which meant the Enola Gay had to be specially modified. Most of the bomb's weight was not the uranium, but the gun barrel, tamper, and casing needed to hold everything together long enough for the chain reaction to proceed. The design had to keep the critical mass assembled for approximately 1 microsecond, long enough for about 80 generations of fission to occur. If the mass separated sooner, the weapon would fizzle. If it stayed together longer, more uranium would fission, but the difference in yield would be relatively small. The explosion released energy equivalent to approximately 15,000 tons of TNT. This is a vast amount of energy, but it is worth noting that Little Boy was relatively small compared to the nuclear weapons developed later. Modern strategic nuclear weapons have yields measured in hundreds of thousands or millions of tons of TNT equivalent. Even so, 15 kilotons was more than enough to destroy a city the size of Hiroshima. The decision to use the atomic bomb was made at the highest levels of the US government. President Harry Truman, who had learned of the Manhattan Project only after becoming president following Franklin Roosevelt's death, authorized the bombing. The decision was controversial, even at the time. Some scientists involved in the project advocated for a demonstration of the weapon on an uninhabited area to convince Japan to surrender without killing civilians. Others argued that a demonstration might fail to convince Japanese leaders, or that it would waste one of only 2 atomic bombs available at the time. Military planners argued that an invasion of Japan would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties, and that using the atomic bomb would save American lives by forcing a quick surrender. The target selection process considered multiple cities. Kyoto, the ancient capital, was initially on the list, but was removed at the insistence of Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who recognized its cultural importance. Hiroshima was selected for several reasons. It was a significant military centerpiece with the headquarters of the 2nd General Army. It had important war industries. It had not been heavily bombed before, which would allow for accurate assessment of the bomb's effects. And its geography, flat and surrounded by hills, would focus the blast wave and maximize damage. The bombing mission was planned and executed with precision. The 509th Composite Group, a special unit of the U.S. Army Air Forces, was formed and trained specifically for atomic bomb missions. The group practiced the necessary flying techniques, including the sharp diving turn needed to escape the blast. They flew practice missions over Japan, dropping conventional bombs with the same size and weight as the atomic bomb to perfect their approach. Weather reconnaissance flights were sent ahead to verify conditions. Everything was choreographed to ensure the mission succeeded. The crew of the Enola Gay was told what they were carrying and what it would do. Captain William Parsons, the bomb's weaponeer, completed the final assembly of Little Boy during the flight to Hiroshima, inserting the conventional explosive charges that would fire the uranium bullet. This was done as a safety measure. If the plane crashed during takeoff, a fully assembled atomic bomb might detonate, destroying the airbase at Tinian Island. Once the components were in place, the bomb was ready. The release over Hiroshima was as planned. The bomb functioned as designed. The mission, from a military standpoint, was a complete success. The medical reality. The medical effects of the Hiroshima atomic bomb unfolded across multiple timescales, from instant vaporization to injuries that would kill within hours, days, weeks, or months. Understanding these effects requires recognizing that the bomb killed through multiple mechanisms simultaneously, each creating its own pattern of casualties. The instant deaths, those occurring in the first few seconds after detonation, were caused primarily by thermal radiation within the first kilometer from the hypocenter. At these distances, the thermal pulse was intense enough to vaporize human tissue. people simply ceased to exist, their bodies converted to gas and carbon. This form of death was at least mercifully instantaneous. Those who died this way never knew what happened to them. One moment they existed, the next they were gone. Beyond the immediate vaporization zone, thermal burns became the dominant form of injury. At 1 kilometer from the hypocenter, people exposed to the thermal pulse received severe third-degree burns over their entire bodies. The skin literally cooked, the outer layers dying immediately, the deeper tissues damaged beyond repair. These burns were among the most painful injuries imaginable, and they were complicated by the fact that medical care was essentially unavailable. In peacetime, in a modern hospital, a person with burns over 50% of their body would require intensive care, including fluid replacement, pain management, infection prevention, and possibly surgery. In Hiroshima, 1 minute after the bombing, people with burns over 80 or 90% of their bodies were wandering the ruins with no prospect of receiving any of these treatments. The shock wave caused its own category of injuries. People were thrown through the air and struck buildings, trees, or the ground with tremendous force. Bones broke, skulls fractured, internal organs ruptured. Traumatic brain injuries were common among those close enough to experience severe blast effects. Many people who survived the initial blast died within minutes or hours from these trauma injuries, bleeding internally or suffering from injuries that would have been survivable with immediate medical care, but were fatal without it. Then there was the radiation. This was the most insidious form of injury because it was invisible and its effects were delayed. A person exposed to a lethal dose of radiation would not immediately feel anything. They might have burns or blast injuries that required immediate attention, distracting from the fact that they had received a dose of radiation that would kill them regardless of how well their other injuries healed. Acute radiation syndrome manifests in stages. In the first hours after exposure, people with high doses experience the prodromal phase: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, fatigue. Then, for many, comes a latent phase where symptoms improve. This false recovery can last days or weeks, during which the person feels better and begins to think they might survive. But then the manifest illness phase begins. Blood cell production drops as bone marrow cells die. White blood cell counts fall, leaving the person vulnerable to infection. Red blood cell counts drop, causing anemia. Platelet counts fall, leading to uncontrolled bleeding. Hair falls out. Lesions appear on the skin and inside the mouth. The person weakens and eventually dies. The radiation doses received by people in Hiroshima varied dramatically, depending on distance from the hypocenter and shielding. People outdoors at 500 meters received doses of 10 to 20 gray, enough to kill within days, even with the best. Medical care. People indoors or behind walls received lower doses depending on the thickness of the shielding. Concrete walls several feet thick could reduce the radiation dose significantly. This created the paradox where some people who appeared to have minor injuries because they were shielded from the blast and thermal effects actually had received lethal doses of radiation and would die weeks later. The medical response in Hiroshima was overwhelmed from the first minute. Approximately 90% of doctors and 93% of nurses in the city were killed or injured in the blast. The hospitals themselves were destroyed or damaged. Medical supplies were burned or buried. There was no electricity, no clean water, no organized system for triaging casualties. Individual medical personnel who survived did what they could with almost no resources. They bandaged wounds with scraps of cloth. They provided water to the thirsty. They moved the injured to whatever shelter could be found. But for most casualties, there was simply no help available. One of the few physicians who remained on duty was Dr. Terafumi Sasaki at the Red Cross Hospital. This hospital was located about 1.4 kilometers from the hypocenter, far enough that the building remained standing though damaged. Dr. Sasaki found himself treating an endless stream of casualties with no help, no supplies, and no clear understanding of what had caused such massive injuries. He worked continuously for days, treating burns, setting broken bones, and simply trying to provide comfort to people who were dying. His experience was repeated at the few other medical facilities that continued to function. Overwhelming numbers of casualties, inadequate resources, and an injury pattern unlike anything doctors had ever seen. The radiation injuries were particularly perplexing because they did not fit known injury patterns. People with no apparent burns or trauma began to sicken and die in the days after the bombing. Their symptoms: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, fever, bleeding, hair loss, suggested some kind of poisoning or disease, but the cause was not immediately understood. Some doctors familiar with radiation biology from X-ray work began to suspect radiation sickness, but the scale was unprecedented. No one had ever seen radiation sickness in thousands of people simultaneously. The treatment of radiation syndrome in 1945 was rudimentary at best. The basic approach was supportive care, providing fluids, treating infections with antibiotics if available, transfusing blood if possible, and trying to keep the patient comfortable. These treatments had limited effectiveness. People with severe radiation exposure died regardless of treatment. People with moderate exposure sometimes recovered, sometimes died, with no clear pattern to predict who would survive. The survival rate was partly a matter of the dose received, partly a matter of the person's overall health and age, and partly just luck. In the weeks after the bombing, the full scale of the radiation effects became apparent. People who had entered the city after the bombing to help with rescue efforts began to sicken. People who had seemed to be recovering from their initial injuries suddenly worsened. The death toll continued to climb. By the end of 1945, between 90,000 and 166,000 people had died in Hiroshima from the immediate and delayed effects of the bombing. This number includes instant deaths, deaths from burns and trauma in the first days, deaths from radiation sickness in the first weeks, and deaths from infections and complications in the first months. The long-term medical effects would continue for decades. Beginning about 2 years after the bombing, leukemia rates among survivors began to rise. The peak occurred around 4 to 6 years after the bombing. Children were particularly affected. About 10 years after the bombing, solid tumors began appearing at higher rates in survivors. Cancers of the thyroid, breast, lung, stomach, and other organs. These elevated cancer rates would persist for the rest of the survivors' lives. Even 60 or 70 years after the bombing, survivors were showing higher cancer rates than comparable populations who were not exposed to radiation. Pregnant women who survived the bombing faced particular tragedies. Many had miscarriages. Others delivered babies with birth defects or developmental problems. Children exposed in utero showed higher rates of intellectual disability and growth impairment. These effects were dose-dependent. The higher the radiation exposure, the more likely and more severe the effects. However, children born to survivors after the bombing, who were conceived after the radiation exposure, showed no elevated rates of birth defects or genetic diseases. This surprising finding suggested that the genetic damage from radiation was not inherited in the way that had been feared. Historical context and legacy. The atomic bombing of Hiroshima did not occur in isolation. It was the culmination of decisions made over years, shaped by the terrible logic of total war and the desperate desire to bring World War II to an end. Understanding why it happened requires understanding the context of August 1945. Japan had been at war since its invasion of China in 1937. By 1945, Japan was losing. The United States and its allies had pushed back Japanese forces across the Pacific, island by island, at tremendous cost in lives on both sides. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in early 1945 had been particularly bloody, with casualty rates that alarmed American military planners. If these island battles were so costly, what would a land invasion of Japan itself entail? American military planners projected that Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, would result in hundreds of thousands of American casualties and potentially millions of Japanese casualties. These estimates were based on the experience of the island battles and the expectation that Japanese military and civilian resistance would intensify when fighting on their home islands. The Japanese government had shown no willingness to surrender. The Potsdam Declaration of July 1945, which called for Japan's unconditional surrender, had been rejected. Against this backdrop, the atomic bomb appeared to offer a way to end the war quickly, without a bloody invasion. President Truman, advised by Secretary of War Henry Stimson and others, authorized the use of atomic bombs against Japanese cities. The hope was that the shock of such devastation would force Japan to surrender. Alternative strategies, such as continuing the conventional bombing campaign and blockade, might have eventually forced surrender, but would take longer and allow the Soviet Union, which was about to enter the war against Japan, to claim a larger role in the post-war settlement. The moral and ethical dimensions of the decision to use atomic bombs have been debated ever since. Supporters argue that the bombing saved lives by avoiding an invasion and bringing a swift end to the war. They point to the projected casualties of an invasion and to Japan's refusal to surrender, despite conventional bombing that had already killed hundreds of thousands of civilians in firebombing raids on Tokyo and other cities. They argue that the atomic bomb, while terrible, was no more morally wrong than those firebombing raids. Critics argue that Japan was already defeated and would have surrendered without either an invasion or atomic bombing, especially once the Soviet Union declared war. They point to evidence that Japanese leaders were seeking a negotiated surrender through Soviet mediation, though not the unconditional surrender demanded by the Allies. They argue that the primary motivation for using the bomb was not military necessity, but a desire to intimidate the Soviet Union and establish American dominance in the post-war world. They contend that the massive civilian casualties were unjustified and constituted a war crime. The truth likely contains elements of both positions. The decision-makers believed they were facing a choice between bad options: continue a war that was killing thousands daily, invade Japan at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives, or use the atomic bomb to shock Japan into surrender. They chose the atomic bomb, and it did achieve its immediate goal. Japan surrendered 6 days after the Nagasaki bombing. But the human cost was terrible, and the long-term consequences included launching the nuclear arms race that would define the Cold War and continues to threaten humanity today. On August 9, 1945, 3 days after Hiroshima, the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. This bomb, called Fat Man, was a plutonium implosion weapon more powerful than Little Boy. It killed an estimated 40,000 to 75,000 people immediately, with the death toll eventually rising to 80,000. The quick use of the second bomb was intended to convince Japan that America had many atomic bombs and would continue using them until Japan surrendered. In fact, the United States had only the 2 bombs immediately available, though more were being prepared. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio address to the nation, the first time most Japanese people had ever heard their emperor's voice. The formal surrender ceremony took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, officially ending World War II. For the survivors of Hiroshima, called Hibakusha, the end of the war brought new challenges. They faced not only their physical injuries and health problems, but also social discrimination. In Japanese society, many people avoided Hibakusha out of fear that radiation sickness was contagious, or that children of survivors would be somehow contaminated. This stigma made it difficult for survivors to find jobs, get married, or lead normal lives. Many Hibakusha hid their status to avoid discrimination. The occupation forces that controlled Japan after the war imposed strict censorship on information about the atomic bombings. The American authorities did not want detailed descriptions of the bomb's effects to reach the public, fearing it might turn public opinion against the use of atomic weapons. Japanese journalists were prohibited from reporting on the bombings. The censorship was only lifted after the occupation ended in 1952. Once the censorship was lifted, hibakusha began to share their stories more openly, though the stigma persisted. In 1957, the Japanese government passed the Atomic Bomb Survivors Medical Care Law, which provided medical benefits and support to hibakusha. This was an important step in acknowledging their suffering and providing practical assistance. Over time, additional laws and programs were established to help survivors and their families. Today, the remaining hibakusha receive pensions and medical care from the Japanese government, though many continue to suffer from health problems related to their radiation exposure decades ago. Hiroshima and Nagasaki have become powerful symbols in the movement for nuclear disarmament. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial, the ruins of the Genbaku Dome, was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1996. Both cities have peace parks and museums dedicated to educating visitors about the bombings and advocating for a world without nuclear weapons. Hibakusha have traveled the world sharing their testimonies, warning about the horrors of nuclear war, and calling for the elimination of all nuclear weapons. The atomic bombings remain the only use of nuclear weapons in warfare, but the threat of nuclear war has never disappeared. During the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union built arsenals containing tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, many far more powerful than the bombs, dropped on Japan. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction held that neither side would use nuclear weapons because doing so would trigger a retaliatory strike that would destroy both nations. This tense balance kept the peace, but it also created the possibility of global annihilation. Today, 9 nations possess nuclear weapons: the United States, Russia, China, France, the United Kingdom, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel. The total number of warheads has decreased from Cold War peaks, but remains in the thousands. Modern strategic weapons typically have yields measured in hundreds of kilotons or megatons, tens or hundreds of times more powerful than Little Boy. A single modern nuclear weapon could destroy a city far more completely than the Hiroshima bomb. A full-scale nuclear war could end civilization and possibly cause human extinction through direct effects, nuclear winter, and environmental collapse. Closing reflection. Remember Akiko Takakura, the woman from the opening who survived because she happened to be facing away from the window. Here's something she said decades later that captures the arbitrary horror of nuclear weapons. "I was saved by chance. So many people died for no reason other than chance. They were unlucky in where they stood, what they wore, which direction they faced. That's what nuclear weapons do. They make survival random." 1 minute, 60 seconds. The time it takes to boil water, tie your shoes, or read a few paragraphs. In Hiroshima, on August 6, 1945, 1 minute was enough time to destroy a city and kill 80,000 people. The first 60 seconds after the atomic bomb exploded saw flash, heat, radiation, shockwave, fire, and the beginning of suffering that continues today. But here's the twist that should keep you awake at night. Those 60 seconds represent both the end of one era and the beginning of another. Before 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, humanity had never destroyed a city in 1 minute. After 8:16 a.m., we knew it was possible. And once something becomes possible, once we cross that threshold, we can never uncross it. The knowledge exists, the capability exists, the weapons exist. And here's what makes the story of that first minute even more chilling. The bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was tiny by modern standards, primitive, inefficient. little boy released energy equivalent to 15 kilotons of TNT. Modern strategic nuclear weapons measure their yields in hundreds of kilotons or megatons, 10, 50, 100 times more powerful. A single modern nuclear weapon could erase Hiroshima more completely than Little Boy did, and the major nuclear powers possess thousands of these weapons. Think about what this means. Everything you just heard about that first minute in Hiroshima, all the death, the suffering, the destruction, was caused by what is now considered a small tactical nuke. The weapons that exist today could multiply that horror 100-fold. Instead of one city, destroyed, dozens. Instead of 80,000 dead, millions. A full-scale nuclear war could end civilization in the time it takes to watch a movie. The survivors of that first minute carry lessons that remain urgently relevant. Akiko Takakura, who survived by facing the wrong direction at the right time, spent decades telling her story, not to dwell on suffering, but to prevent future suffering. Her message, and the message of all Hibakusha, is profound in its simplicity. This must never happen again. Yet the threat persists. 9 nations now possess nuclear weapons. Thousands of warheads remain ready to launch within minutes. The risk of nuclear war, through deliberate decision, accident, or miscalculation, hasn't disappeared. Based on what we've learned from near misses during the Cold War, there have been multiple occasions when humanity came within minutes of nuclear exchange due to technical failures or misinterpreted data. We've been lucky, but you can't count on luck indefinitely. The physical evidence of the Hiroshima bombing has mostly vanished. The city was rebuilt. Modern buildings cover the sites where thousands died. The rivers flow clean. Trees grow where there was once scorched earth. Only the Peace Memorial remains. The Jinbaku Dome preserved in its ruined state as a deliberate reminder. But the living memory is fading. Each year, fewer Hibakusha remain. Their average age now exceeds 85. Within another decade or two, there may be no living survivors who can tell their stories from direct experience. This makes the story of that first minute more important than ever. The technical details, the physics, the temperatures, the radiation doses, combine with the human stories. Akiko digging herself from rubble, the shadows burned into stone, the children creating fire breaks against bombers that would never come, to create a complete picture of what nuclear weapons actually mean. Not as abstractions, not as numbers, as lived experience, as human tragedy. That woman standing in a bank at 8:14 a.m., facing away from the window, she lived. She survived to tell her story, to warn us, to remind us that nuclear weapons don't discriminate between guilty and innocent, between soldiers and children, between those who make wars and those who suffer them. They simply erase cities and people with equal efficiency. The best tribute we can pay to those who died in that first minute, and to those who survived to bear witness, is to ensure it never happens again. Not in another city, not in another minute, not ever. If this history moved you, please like and subscribe to support our continued exploration of the moments that shaped our world. More importantly, learn about nuclear weapons, their dangers, and the movements working toward their elimination. The story of Hiroshima isn't just history. It's a warning that becomes more urgent with every year that passes, every weapon that's built, every crisis that brings nuclear powers into conflict. What happened in 1 minute on August 6, 1945, must remain a unique tragedy, not a preview of the future. We know what 1 minute of nuclear war looks like. We've seen it. We've documented it. We've heard the testimonies. The question is, have we learned enough to ensure it stays in the past? Thank you for listening. Remember Akiko. Remember the shadows. Remember the first minute. And work to ensure there's never a second one.